Is a utility knife a folding pocket knife, and are you allowed to carry one? The reason I phrase it like that is because a folding pocket knife is exempt under Section 139 of the Criminal Justice Act 1988, meaning you can carry one and don't need a specific good reason to carry it, unlike most other blades and pointed articles. But there's been lots of questions raised about utility knives in particular and various other things in my previous video, so I thought I'd cover some of those in this video, so please do stay tuned and subscribe. Welcome back to the channel. So there's lots of questions raised in this previous video, so I thought I'd answer some of those now and show you a utility knife and my thoughts on it in person so you can get a better idea of it. Let's move first of all to some of these questions because these pop up again and again. Now, the first one that comes up is the 3 inches from the hinge or the tang. I carry a Swiss Army knife. I wear calipers and use them alongside Loctite and spares in case of failure. So let's talk about the length of the blade. Now, the length of the blade itself is measured from this point, not from the handle and not anywhere further down where the tang, which is the bit that goes inside the handle, goes further down. It is from this point here. So this is from the utility knife I'll show you in a moment. This is the saw, and there is also the knife portion of it, neither of which are more than 3 inches, so both of which are perfectly fine for reasons I'll come on to in a minute. So it doesn't matter whether or not, if I go back to the picture for a moment, it doesn't matter if you see this little lip bit here at the bottom end, whether that bit is blunt or sharp. You're not measuring it from that point there to the rest of the blade. You're measuring it from this point here because that metal portion is part of the blade. Now, let's say, for example, you had half of it that was blunt. Let's say this bit here was blunt and the rest of it was sharp. That doesn't matter. The measurement is taken from the tip to this point here, at the very least. And that is assuming that this is a straightforward cut-off section between the blade and the handle. Lots of people will disagree in the comments. You're what's called wrong. The blade is measured from this point to the tip. So it doesn't matter if it's sharp or not. There's been a case where a butter knife was found to be a blade for the purposes of the same legislation, and that, of course, is not a sharp edge. So it doesn't matter. The court said we would invite mischief if in case after case we were inviting question as to whether or not the item was sharp. It doesn't matter. It's that length of the blade that counts. Back to the questions. So lots of people carry Multitools and Leatherman and so on. And so Buckley J Teams says, I carry a Letterman Surge. It has 2 3-inch blades on it, locking, but used for work. So that's what we'll come back to in a minute. So you'll need a good reason. Now, there are lots of things that will be good reason. Work is a good one, so long as it is something that you would genuinely use a knife for. If you're an accountant, you're not really using a big knife for work unless it's for opening letters and things like that. But even then, why would you be carrying it around in public? That might be an excuse, but it wouldn't be a good reason because you're not doing your accounting walking around the streets, for example. Someone else says, what about a multi-tool? Most have blades, some locking, etc. So let's take a look at those blades themselves, because analyzing one of these in person is probably the best way of doing it. So this is a fairly nondescript, not a particularly good utility knife, because I was given this one and I don't tend to buy them and own them. But nonetheless, this has a lot of tools on it, and most of which are probably an okay job, but not a particularly fantastic job in and of themselves. But if we look at the knife itself, it comes out and it's not particularly sharp, and it folds back in immediately without any kind of locking mechanism whatsoever, which is fine for the legislation. So that satisfies the legislation. Likewise, the saw, I dare say it's probably not a brilliant saw. It might work for a while. It may work longer than I expect it to. I don't expect it to last very long. But again, that would be a blade. It doesn't, remember what I said, it doesn't matter whether it is a quote-unquote sharp blade like this one might be. I mean, it's not particularly sharp by my standards, but it doesn't matter if it's absolutely sharp or not. It's a blade of sorts. Is it pointed? No, not really. Interesting point, a screwdriver has come outside of this remit, so very odd. Case law has decided different things on different merits. But this one being a saw, again, not locking, so that's perfectly fine. So this is a multi-tool. This would be considered a folding pocket knife. Now, as for all the other tools, they are just tools. They're not blades, so there's no issue with those. Contrast that with something like this, which is a locking blade, and it would be too long for a folding pocket knife anyway. But if we take a look at the length of this blade, again measuring from this point here, we are over 3 inches. If the camera will focus, we are over 3 inches there. Not by very much, but it is over 3 inches. But more importantly, this locks. So because this locks in place and it requires the press of this button here, it is not a folding pocket knife for the purposes of legislation, and therefore you would need a good reason to carry it. Those good reasons could be anything along the lines of your work and whether you are going somewhere that you would ordinarily use one of these knives for. For example, we have another question in the comment section here. Still not sure about the Swiss Army knife that I have for camping. I bought it in a camping shop, so I assumed it's okay for me to take with me camping. I'll be honest though, all it ever gets used for is when I do go camping is opening packets of food, and I never actually need it outside of the campsite itself. Well, opening packets of food while you're on a campsite is probably a good reason, because you need something to open the packets with, because otherwise you'll be tearing them open, biting them open or whatever. And so if you're on a campsite and you are opening food and you've brought a knife with you, some kind of utility knife or Swiss Army knife, whatever, to do that with, that's perfectly fine, even if it locks. But do remember that you will have to stand up to scrutiny if you are questioned about why you've got it with you. But if you and your family are in a tent on a campsite, you're there for a week, it's pre-booked, and you've got the knife with you, and you get the police rap on the side of the tent and say, why have you got this knife with you, which is a bit of a ridiculous situation to be in. But if they do that, your answer to that is quite straightforward. I'm camping. I've got this knife with me. Should I need it for opening packets of food, sharpening twigs, cutting things, cutting rope, whatever that might be? You're camping, and that's your good reason to have it. That is very different than walking around a clothes shop in the middle of town with a big knife in your pocket. And so, or even a small knife that locks, because even if you get a small knife that locks, then that would not be a folding pocket knife. Now, interestingly enough, if I bring my other camera back on here. So this tiny one here, I'll be honest with you, I bought for the sole purposes of demonstrating in this video what is a folding pocket knife that you might be able to carry around. Not that this is legal advice. And I bought it with my own money, so this is not a sponsored video. And I've not actually used it very much, so I can't really vouch to the quality, durability, etc. But maybe I will do in time. But this opens up into a fairly nice pair of pliers, which you could probably use for certain things whilst you're camping. And also a few other tools that come out of the side here, like a pair of scissors, and there is also a little blade that comes out. But again, it's a non-locking blade. It's immediately foldable at all times. But the important distinction here is if this were to lock in position and require the press of a button or something else to close it, then this would be a restricted blade, and you would need a good reason to have it with you. But again, if you were camping, that would be fine. But as it is a folding at all times type thing, so it's perfectly fine. Now, there is a comment I'd like to address here, because this says, in a world where self-defense is considered being the mindset to cause harm is just a contradiction, it says here. Now, I'd like to distinguish this, because if you are carrying something with the intent of using it to cause harm, that is different to having it with you and then you use it in the spur of the moment because you feel you have no choice. If you form that intention before you leave the house, for example, the aforementioned utility with the hammer attached here, if I were to take this out with the sole purpose of harming somebody with it, it would be my intent to use it to cause harm that makes it an offensive weapon. It is not an offensive weapon per se, it's just a tool. But just like anything else, virtually anything else can become an offensive weapon if it's made to cause harm, adapted to cause harm, or carried with the intent of using it to cause harm. But that is your intent before you leave the house, not in the moment of self-defense. And so my point in the previous video is that if you have a blade of sorts with you and you use that in self-defense, the onus is going to be upon you that you did not carry it with the purposes of causing harm with it, and it was just in that moment. But for all of those scenarios, you do, I stress, need to seek formal legal advice if you are questioned and were still charged with something. There's another comment further down which I must address because there are many comments like this, and says, I'm pretty sure a locking feature is a safety feature and is still generally immediately closing in the eyes of the law. Well, it's not, because if this blade here locks and it requires the press of a button to close it, it is not immediately foldable. it requires the press of a button to close. It is relatively immediately foldable at the press of a button, but courts have held that immediately foldable means it cannot lock, and if it requires the press of a button or lever or anything else to close it, it's not immediately foldable. Therefore, it is not a folding pocket knife. So let's not peek around the bush here. No pun intended to the campers among you. This knife legislation, it isn't aimed at most people. It's just a baseline that is set. Most knife crime, of course, is committed with either kitchen knives or these specially designed ridiculous things that people are carrying around. So obviously, yes, this legislation doesn't have any deterrent on them, apparently, but it is there as a baseline and with which to prosecute. And believe me, they will be prosecuted if they are carrying around something like this where there is obviously no good reason to carry it around. And just for the record, I don't advocate carrying around knives unless you do need it for some reason at some point, because if you are going camping, then I would be taking something with me. I might take this with me. I might take this with me. I might take this other small thing with me if I were going camping or whatever. So you can always argue your good reason, just be prepared to argue it robustly. And if it sounds like an excuse, for example, I went camping at the weekend and that's why I still have this in my pocket in the bar on a Tuesday night, that's an excuse, not a good reason. Now, depending on how you cooperate, how you behave, how you have been behaving, and what's the reason you were found with it in the first place, all those things taken together, the police might just take a pragmatic approach and say, look, just don't do that again because you're not supposed to have it. Or if you're involved in a fight and you pull it out and they say, why have you got it? And you say, well, I went camping at the weekend and I forgot it's in my pocket. Just so happened I ended up in a fight and pulled a knife out. Then obviously that doesn't sound like a good reason anymore. And it sounds very much more like an excuse, and probably a bad one at that. So use a bit of common sense. If you're going camping, you'll probably find just, keep good records of where you're going and what you're doing, what you've got the knife with you for, and all that sort of stuff. And so be prepared to explain it, but don't overly worry about it. The law isn't looking to accuse everybody of everything all the time. It is just there as a baseline. So again, keep the questions coming. I hope that's somewhat useful. And please do subscribe if you want more of these questions answered. Not legal advice, of course, but just general guidance. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.